Hello and welcome to the 217th episode of From Alpha to Omega. Today is Tuesday the 3rd of June 2022 and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. This episode, I'm delighted to welcome Anna Fielder to the podcast to talk about her recent book, Going into Labour, Childbirth in Capitalism. Anna is a sociologist in the Midwifery Department, Auckland University of Technology, and a former practising midwife. This is part one of a two-parter, the second part of which will be released next week. This episode, I have the new patrons Hector A. Miranda and Pan27 to thank. If you'd like to help support the show, please head on over to the Patreon and fire me a few commie dollar. Your help keeps the show afloat. And if you are listening on YouTube, please give the show a like and make a comment to juice that algorithm. And if you're a podcast listener, please leave a review on your podcatcher of choice. And finally, if you'd like to help support the book project that Donal and myself are working on, head on over to theclassisocietyinmotion.com. We literally couldn't do this project without all your help. Okay, to the discussion. Okay, Anna, I recently read your new book, Going into Labour, Childbirth and Capitalism, that is out this year from Pluto Books. This year or last year? It's late last year.
November last year, yeah.
November last year. I was at the launch. I think you gave there was a book launch at Historical Materialism, or there was a panel that you gave about the book. What was your reasons for writing the book? What motivated you initially?
Well, it did start as a thesis and then eventually became a book. But what prompted me to research the area were a number of factors. I grew up during the miners' strike in the north of England. I was about 7 when Thatcher came to power. I grew up during the era of Thatcherism. And you knew which side you were on. And you were certainly not on Thatcher's side. You were on the side of the miners. And I never questioned that, and rightly so. I think that was absolutely incredibly important, that was not even a matter of debate. By my late teens, I was involved in Marxist politics myself. And there was a lot of talk about labour, the sort of labour, industrial labour, the labour of miners, etc., etc. And that's really, really important. But I'd also grown up with a mother as a midwife. And so I knew a very different kind of labour as well. I was quite au fait with the labour of childbirth. I think I'd been at births relatively early in my life. And when I eventually trained to become a midwife myself, which was in my 20s, I delved more into another kind of politics where there was a lot of discussion of labour again, but it was a very different sort of labour that was being discussed in Marxist and left-wing political circles. And I realised that within the left circles I was involved in, there was very little talk of the labour of childbirth. And within the birth workers' circles, the midwifery circles, etc., that I was involved in, there was very little talk of capitalism. There was quite a lot of talk about patriarchy. Increasingly, we've got really very strong, really important analysis of systemic racism running through the perinatal services, the so-called maternity services. And I say so-called because the word maternity is very gendered, and not everybody who gives birth does identify as a woman or a mother. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And sometimes I use the term perinatal services instead of maternity services in order to be inclusive. I realised that within the circles I was working, there was, in relation to birth, there was hardly any mention of capitalism, and there was no mention of Marx. Nonetheless, it seemed to me that the issues that were affecting birth, that were really shaping the conditions in which midwives, etc., worked, and still do, were incredibly shaped by capitalism, and that Marxist analysis might actually be really useful in helping us to make sense of those. So in a way, what I sought to do was to bring together these two strands of my life that had never really met before, which was the politics of birth and Marxist left-wing politics. And previously, it felt like never the twain shall meet. So yeah, I brought them two together in this book. It's essentially a Marxist analysis of childbirth.
Was there much like Marxist analysis of childbirth already out there before you did your book? You know, we have Marxist feminism and we have, all this good stuff, but specifically the childbirth aspect.
Not a lot. Marx, Engels, you get passing reference to childbirth occasionally. Within Marxist feminism, again, you get more passing reference to childbirth than you do within Marx and Engels, but nonetheless, it tends to be passing reference. Actually, a really systematic analysis of the role of capitalism in relation to childbirth, I wasn't seeing it anywhere. I was seeing work that was certainly very influenced by Marxism, that stood more in the tradition of Shulamith Firestone and was considering the potential of always sitting behind that work is a sort of awareness of the potential of birth to be taken inside, pregnancy and human gestation, birth to be taken inside, entirely outside of the human body. But that wasn't what interested me. And I guess even if that becomes possible, we will still face birth. We will still have birth unless we are talking about enforced sterilisation of the population. And so I think we are stuck with birth. I don't see it as a negative thing. And so what I'm really interested in is how we make birth as safe in all ways. And I mean safe, emotionally safe, as well as physically safe for human beings. That's what interests me about childbirth.
So I've got to commend you for the names of some of the chapters in the book. They're very, very good. You do a Marxist analysis. I think chapter 2 is called Stretch Marks. It really made me laugh. There was a couple of other very good ones. You know, you were going to the debates here. I was wondering if you could talk about them, about how like the act of both carrying the child and giving birth to the child is understood from, say, a Marxist economic point of view.
Can I just, before I do, say something about stretch marks? I can't take credit for that. Fanon talks about the need to stretch Marxist analysis if we're going to take account of the colonial context, colonial situations. And I read it and went, oh my goodness. And I just had this moment where I went, I'm going to have to rip off of that. Stretch marks, of course. So I can't really take credit for that.
Yeah, take the credit. Take the credit. Yeah.
And actually, at the end of the day, I'm not convinced I stretch Marx that far. To some extent, you know, my analysis of my reading of value surplus value is pretty classically Marxist. So I'm not sure how far I stretch Marx, apart from to use Marxism to look at an area, i.e. childbirth, that really doesn't tend to be looked at by Marxists. And you don't think of childbirth and then think, I know, I'll go to Marx in order to analyse childbirth. Nobody really does that. So, yeah, that's the sense in which I think I stretch Marx. Okay, so I guess I'm very aware that Marx didn't say a great deal about childbirth. He did mention it from time to time, but I think it wasn't his concern. That's not what he was interested in. And I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I think he gets criticised for not taking account of lots of things, particularly issues relating to gender. And yeah, we can critique Marx for that. He was a product of who he was at the time he was writing, etc., etc. But also, if he'd been focusing on those issues, I'm not convinced he would have produced the analysis of capital that he did. And I actually think he wrote an incredibly important analysis of capital. So I'm not somebody who's going to particularly criticise him for not having focused enough on childbirth. There are certainly gaps in his analysis of capital. I'm not debating that. But what he, for a lot of his work, his stuff on capital, he was trying to make sense of what capital is. Started with the commodity, as we know. And a lot of what he was looking at was focus on what you might call the circuit of capital and what happens within that circuit and how surplus value is produced within that circuit. Now, what he understood was that the production of labour power sits outside of that circuit. And although he does occasionally focus on just talk a bit about the production of labour power, he often frames it in terms of consumption. In other words, workers' wages are suppressed, they're kept as low as possible by the capitalists in order to maximise profit accumulation by the capitalists, etc. And that suppresses the capacity of the workers to purchase the means of subsistence, etc. And therefore, the means by which they might reproduce the next generation of workers, which involves a process of, at some point, childbirth. So to some extent, birth doesn't sit within much his analysis, really, because capital itself, although it depends on birth, it requires new workers to be produced for capitalism to continue. Capital itself doesn't really concern itself much with the process, the act by which human beings are born, certainly in the era that he was writing. And so that's left to the workers. You sort that out. So I think a lot of Marx's, and Engels particularly, his references to childbirth sit in the context of that the working conditions and the living conditions in which workers also gave birth, primarily in the era in which Marx and Engels were writing, were poverty-stricken in, for example, the proletarian urban centres of industrial capitalism. And the city that comes to mind for me is Manchester, because that's where I've lived. I love that city, and it's where Engels spent quite a lot of his time as he was writing Condition of the Working Class in England. But they were aware that because reproduction, if you like, of labour power sits outside the circuits of capital, capital doesn't even really need to concern itself with it, although it needs it. So you get then people giving birth in incredibly impoverished conditions in that era in which Engels was writing Condition of the Working Class in England, for instance. He writes about the pathologies of pregnancy that were inflicted upon young female workers, etc., through rickets, through the chemicals that workers were subjected to within the factories, within the mills, etc. And he's aware of the influence this had on childbearing, and it wasn't good. Marx, you've got the odd footnote in Capital, Volume 1. There's one where Marx talks about obstetricians attending births or doctors attending births in homes where there's mud on the floor, and they're having to drill a hole through the wall in order to get enough sort of air into the room. And he says something along the lines of, or the footnotes from somebody else says something along the lines of, well, drilling a hole through the wall in order to get a bit of air wasn't actually a difficult task, given the conditions of those houses. So in relation to productive labour, I think Marx and Engels saw that because of the dynamics of capital and the way that they depended on the extraction of surplus value from productive labour, but also minimised the extent to which suppressed wages and kept them as low as possible in order to maximise accumulation. It meant that the living and therefore birthing conditions of the working class were not good. But I think they saw those conditions, those living conditions, as an effect of the exploitation of productive labour in the industrial era of capitalism that they were writing about.
Yeah, so there's a real contradiction, like, between capital's need for a workforce and like the way capital just does not recognize childbirth as productive labor. It's non-productive from a capitalist point of view, doesn't generate any surplus value, or they can't exploit it in any real sense. It's like a very deep contradiction within the system itself.
I mean, there's debates around this, particularly now with the emergence of commercial surrogacy, whether pregnancy itself produces surplus value. I touch on those arguments in the book. It's not really the area that interests me. I'm more interested in pregnancy and birth generally, I think. And I don't focus on the technologies of conception either. I focus on birth itself. But yeah, there is a a contradiction. Like I say, my reading of value is pretty classically Marxist. I don't see pregnancy itself as producing value in the capitalist sense of value. I mean, I think it's valuable, but that's a different meaning of value, or surplus value. So I do locate the production of value and surplus value in that sphere of wage work. And I don't think I could do the analysis that I've done if I didn't. Well, I know I couldn't. And I think the analysis in terms of the suppression of the wages of birth workers, midwives, etc., is really important. So that is integral to my understanding of where value and surplus value are produced. But in terms of that contradiction between capital needing birth to happen, but also needing to accumulate to the extent that individual capitalists actually are often not that concerned with birth itself. It's seen as what workers do in their own private lives. So I found the work of Nancy Fraser quite useful when I'm thinking about this, because she talks, and it's her article, Contradictions of Capital and Care. She talks about how capital's drive to accumulate is in contradiction with the reproductive processes upon which capital depends. So the drive to accumulate potentially eats away at the conditions in which reproduction can take place, and sometimes she argues that contradiction turns into crisis. Now, some of that whole set of dynamics that affects reproduction generally, I think, very definitely impacts upon childbirth and upon childbirthing processes. And it does this in different ways at different times. So Fraser, she talks about 19th century laissez-faire capitalism, and I think there are different ways of periodizing this, but she talks about 19th century laissez-faire capitalism as an era in which you've got the capitalist drive to accumulate, and the reproduction of the working class was seen as largely the autonomous responsibility of workers. So they were seen as, to some extent, separate. And those workers tended to live in very poor, impoverished conditions, with the state not really been involved in that process of reproduction. So she's talking here about what might be called the capitalist European core, for example, in Manchester. Although I think the idea of a core, or the core in this context, is problematic given the dependence of those cities on, for example, slavery at the time. Anyway, to go back to Nancy Fraser's work, I think it's important because she gestures towards some of the dynamics that sit behind Marx and Engels' awareness that as capital expanded, the workers were living and reproducing themselves in impoverished conditions. And Marx and Engels were both aware of such things as very high infant death rates, of people having no option but to return to work within days of having to give birth, of them often having to leave babies at home, sometimes drugged with a sedative and opiate that Marx refers to as Gordon's cordial, in order that they could return to work. So you've got a real pushing in this area of the working class to the point that their health was incredibly poor, and the average age of death in cities like Manchester, Liverpool, was really quite low amongst the industrial working class, and people were giving birth when they were relatively young. And that's partly because the duration of life was so short. But when you got to the era of what Fraser calls 20th century state-managed capitalism, the state was intervening more in the reproduction of the labour force. And then you've got a very different set of dynamics developing. You've got, during that era, the state intervening in such things as regulation of birth workers. And you've got, during this era, the movement of births into hospitals. And we're talking here about what's referred to as the global north. Developments in the global south have been related, but a bit different. So you've got, in a lot of areas of the global north, some births happening prior to this era in hospitals, but the tendency for pretty much all births to take place in hospitals is essentially a 20th century development. It happened at different times in the 20th century in different areas of the global north and for different groups of people at different times, but it happened. And you've got the vast majority. Once you've got the vast majority of births happening in hospitals, birth is taking place in the domain, on the territory of medicine. And what's really interesting, I won't go into it now, is the contradictory role of medicine within capitalism. But coming back to birth, you've got in this era of what one New Zealand midwife refers to as the shift from her home to his hospital birth, the shift from birth taking place in women's homes, in her home to his hospital. Now, I don't overplay the gender dimension of the transition of birth into hospitals, because yes, to some extent, it was a gendered transition. And once birth happened in hospitals, it was taking place on the terrain of medicine, and the vast majority of doctors at that point were men. But you've got a lot more than that happening. You've got imperialism, there was racism operating, of course, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I live. The transition of births into hospitals took place later for Māori than it did for Pākehā, people of European descent. So if hospitals were gendered spaces, they were also colonial spaces. It's important to remember that. And in hospitals, you've got this emergence of what some people saw as increased safety. That's debatable, highly debatable. But you'd also got a more coercive element once people moved into hospitals to give birth in large numbers. You got people moving through increasingly within the hospital system what became like a conveyor belt system, like a conveyor belt-like system within hospitals. People were passing through hospitals, and hospitals are pretty hierarchical institutions. They were passing through hospitals as they gave birth with all the coercion that entailed. So to some extent, you've got a shift from neglect to coercion. That's one way of looking at that shift in capitalism and the ways in which it affected birth for some people. So it's a different set of dynamics in the mid-20th century, operating in relation to childbirth and people's birthing experiences than what you had in 19th century industrial capitalism and the so-called European core. So the era of capitalism that followed that mid-20th century is what Nancy Fraser calls, I think she refers to it as financialized neoliberal capitalism. You've got people subject to a different set of dynamics again. You're moving towards the end of the 20th century by this point. You've got the movement of more and more, even middle-class white women into paid employment. You've got a movement away from what was in many ways previously an idealized but also unachievable for many women notion of women as housewife. And today, I mean, many households need at least 2 wages to even survive. So the notion of the housewife whose primary job is to produce children feels pretty much impossible for many households. And most women certainly wouldn't want that anyway. And during this era, you've got declining rates of birth in the global north. You've got the age at which people give birth is higher than it used to be, particularly in the global north. People can't afford to have babies or take time off work to care for them. I'm thinking the US in this context as a prime example. And in this area, you've also got not only the suppression of wages, but cuts on public spending, movement away from state investment in public services such as hospitals. You've now got a real shortage of staff in many maternity hospitals, perinatal hospitals, if you like. And that impacts on birth and how people experience birth in different ways again. And I'll say a bit more about that later. But I guess what I'd say is that contradiction works differently in different eras, and the ways in which the contradictions of capital play out in relation to childbirth and pregnancy shift and change as the configurations of capital also shift and change.
So can you tell us, Anna, then about how midwifery as a trade, as a profession, has evolved over time?
Yeah, so firstly, let me upfront this with a little discussion on the word midwife. The word midwife stems from medieval English mid, meaning with, and woman, with, woman. Midwife with woman. It's often interpreted in that way, the word midwife, as meaning with woman, the woman who's with the woman who gives birth. The midwife was somebody who went into labour to be with the person. So, yeah, the midwife was somebody who was called by the birthing person or whoever, called upon to support that person when they were in labour. But if we prioritise that history and assume that midwife was a universal term, we're in danger of essentially imposing a European, even an English history on the rest of the world. In other parts of the world, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, for instance, in the pre-colonial era, men, it seems, often played a really important role in attending births. So the midwife, the word midwife meaning the woman, interpreted as the word the woman who is with the woman in birth, is a very English, it's based on an English history, and I think we need to remember that. So with those caveats in mind, I think if we see the midwife as someone who's with the person giving birth, the pressures on that role, the extent to which midwives can actually do the work of being with a birthing person has certainly shifted over time. So historically in Europe, the midwife would have been called to a birth, along perhaps with other people, friends, what were called godsips, to be with the birthing person. The midwife often stayed for quite a few days after the birth as well. In time, barber surgeons, what later became seen as doctors, started to attend even births where surgical interventions were not needed or required. And this history is deeply tied up with the development of forceps as a birth tool. And the fact that, generally speaking, once forceps were developed and became used relatively widely, midwives were generally not seen fit to use those tools. So generally, midwives didn't use forceps. In addition to the fact that forceps could be used, if they were used well, to save the life of a birthing person and the baby once forceps had been developed, forceps could also be used to speed up labours that were a bit slow, that were taking a while to happen. So the development of forceps is quite important. The use to which forceps were put by doctors is quite important, by barber surgeons is really important in relation to what happened to the role of midwives. So the tools, forceps, were really celebrated in many quarters. They were used in ways that started to mean that, particularly among the wealthier classes, doctors began to make more inroads into the market for attending births. And in time, in some areas, particularly more affluent areas, doctors gained pretty much a virtual monopoly in the market for attending births. It's doctors with forceps, and they could charge quite a lot more for attending births than midwives could do. So midwives became your working class birth attendants, and doctors became the birth attendants quite often, not always, but quite often of the wealthier classes. But in this context, the role of midwives being the primary person who was with the birthing person through the journey of childbirth began to change. And the word with is interesting here too, because doctors, barber surgeons, generally weren't doing the work of being with people through childbirth as midwives had done or had been, if they were using forceps to speed up the birthing process, and if they were leaving the home immediately after a birth to attend to other patients. So the very idea of being with the birthing person, or of working with somebody in and through a trusted relationship, is really crucial in midwifery. The work of being with, working alongside, supporting that person. And that's a set of skills that is increasingly in capitalism difficult for midwives to do. Midwives increasingly been prevented from using and developing those skills of sitting with a birthing person, supporting them to do the work of the labour of childbirth. So it's interesting. That notion of being with, the midwife being with, has changed quite a lot. The pressures on that role have made it increasingly difficult for midwives to do that work of being with a birthing person, to support them as that person acts autonomously, the birthing person acts autonomously. So by the 20th century, you got a doctor in the States, Delhi, who was talking about the need, pretty much all people having their first babies, we should use forceps on them. And you got this use of forceps at an incredibly high proportion of births. And with that came all sorts of complications, because particularly when what hand washing and aseptic techniques, etc., were not prevalent. Putting metal instruments into somebody's body was not conducive to good hygiene, and we had high rates of maternal death to puerperal sepsis, which is infection associated with this high use of forceps.
Did you say somewhere in it that it was quite late in the 20th century before posh women having these medicalized births had better outcomes than, say, just midwives in the home delivering the children naturally in non-medicalized scene due to all this sterilization and stuff?
It's not that stark, but there were certainly areas of England. I think it will probably be it will be earlier than that. It wouldn't be late 20th century. There were certainly areas of England that were working class areas where it appears that the maternal death rate was lower than it was in middle class areas. And if you think about the social determinants of health, poverty, etc., you wouldn't expect that. So one of the arguments that's been sort of demonstrated as applicable in this context is that poor women used midwives who weren't using forceps, and they weren't over interfering in birth, if you like, because they didn't have the tools to do it. It wasn't really part of their ethos to do that either. And middle class women, there were cases of middle class women having higher death rates that have been put down to that over intervention. And not just over intervention that then leads to puerperal sepsis and deaths by infection, but also damage to the baby. Forceps been used in ways that damage the baby, in ways that are not helpful for the woman's pelvic tissue either. Not helpful being slightly a mild way of putting it.
In this kind of, we can start to get to a more kind of a production line approach to childbirth. I was wondering if you could talk about like this active management of labour model that seems to have predominated across the world.
Yeah, so that comes in probably around the late 1960s. The active management of labour is associated with Kieran O'Driscoll, an obstetrician in Dublin. And the active management of labour was a set of protocols, if you like, that he developed for the hospital that he was master of. That's a terminology, master. So yeah, the National Maternity Hospital Dublin was where he worked. And the active management of labour was a set of protocols whereby the health professionals diagnosed labour. In other words, you couldn't just say you're in labour and be admitted into hospital. It was labour, the beginning of labour was diagnosed by midwife or doctor, whatever. And only when you were seen to be in labour could you stay in the hospital. And there were strict protocols regarding labour progress. So the person who was giving birth, their cervix was expected to dilate by 1 centimetre an hour. If it didn't, the first line of intervention was breaking the waters. And then if it continued to not dilate at 1 centimetre an hour, the next line of intervention was putting up a drip of pharmaceutical oxytocin. And that is a drug that contracts the uterus. So this, if birth wasn't imminent, after 12 hours, there would be a cesarean section. So what this did was it sometimes is the pinnacle of concern about the duration of birth, and making sure that somebody gave birth within 12 hours of the start of labour meant that births were produced more of a system that was seen to be more efficient in managing hospital space. It was also, I associate it with Fordism. I'm not the only one who associates it with Fordism. Other people talk about, I do as well, the Taylorism as in that model of approach to the active management of labour. So it's the management not just of labour of childbirth, but of the workers who are in the hospital as well. So the workers in the hospital, the midwives, for instance, are focused in a particular ward. Women come into the hospital and they stay in that ward, and then they'll move on to another ward when they've had their baby. So whereas historically midwives would have gone to the women in their homes or wherever, and they would have staffed the woman, if you like, although staffed is the wrong word to use in that context. What you've got here is, and you've got it before then, but this is a sort of a streamlining of this process, if you like, and making birth more efficient within the hospital context. You've got particular wards being staffed, and then the women pass through those wards to other wards where there are a different set of workers. I see it as, a bit like the beginnings of a conveyor belt system of labour. So that's one of the forms of management of labour that is very much associated with Fordism and Taylorism as well. Very strict delineation of tasks on the labour ward, who does what, etc.
We did a home birth of my son here, and that 1 centimetre per hour dilation thing was still pretty much, it seemed to me, kind of like a guideline for management of the birth. What has been the lasting impact of this approach?
I mean, you've certainly got a lot of elements of it that are still there. I mean, I don't think O'Driscoll's active management of labour protocol is necessarily implemented to the letter in many places anymore. But you get aspects of it that are certainly still used, and an emphasis on the length of labour, how long labour takes, etc., is very prevalent in most maternity units. Yeah. And like you say, even at home births, etc. Yeah.
Randomly, I was in New York about 25 years ago, and we bumped into 2 obstetricians in Central Park, of all places, and they were quizzing. It was just like me and some of my Irish friends, or maybe 20 or something. I remember just reading your book. I couldn't believe it. I think they were talking about this guy, O'Driscoll, and they were saying what they were really impressed with. In Ireland, they had much lower cesarean rates than they were having in the US by implementing a similar type system. But can you just talk about the differences on how, not to say that that how it was done in the National Hospital was particularly good or anything, but there was elements that were excluded as this model got pushed out across the world?
Okay, yeah. I mean, this is fascinating. There are lots of variables that feed into caesarean section rates, but you're right. He was seen to have relatively low caesarean section rates. I mean, the state's caesarean section rates were high, possibly for slightly different reasons that may be related to insurance, etc. I'd have to look at that, but there are lots of different factors linked to capitalism, I would argue, that feed into and fed into the caesarean section rate in the States, for example, towards the end of the 20th century. But one of the aspects of O'Driscoll's active management of labour protocol, and I haven't mentioned it so far, was that he saw one-to-one care of the birthing person, he would have used the word woman, in labour. That's important, really important. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for this, and also bear in mind that a lot of these people that were doing the one-to-one care would have maybe been medical students or may have been student midwives. Now, the student midwives were probably already qualified nurses, okay? But you got this one-to-one care of the birthing person during labour. So somebody who pretty much never left the room was there tending to what she needed, etc. They may have also been counting the number of drips that went through the drip counter, because this was prior to, you didn't want to overstimulate this person's uterus. And this was probably at that era prior to the development of drips where that was very automated. So all sorts of things going on there. But when aspects of the active management of labour were expanded out beyond the National Maternity Hospital in Dublin, and they became relatively prevalent practice in the UK and different parts of the world, one of the things that tended to go was the one-to-one care of the woman in labour. And that idea of a midwife being able to sit with somebody while she labours, while that person labours, without somebody else who they're meant to be caring for in another room, etc., etc. I think a lot of midwives long for that to be the case, and it's just not an incredibly busy, understaffed maternity unit. So it's quite likely, in fact, there's evidence to suggest that this is the case, that it was the presence of the midwife or of another staff member being with the birthing person during that labour, that work of being with, that is and was the most influential factor in reducing the need for a caesarean section in labour. And I find this fascinating because it really resonates with a pretty classically Marxist analysis, in the sense that Marx understood that as capital expands, what we get is a growth in constant capital and a relative reduction in variable capital. And what you've got in birthing environments that resonates with that, you've got a vast increase in birth taking place in large institutions, some of which are in very literal senses capital. Births taking place using large amounts of equipment, instruments, medical tech, pharmaceuticals, and so on and so forth. So what was once done via forceps is today more likely to be birthed in a hospital theatre by caesarean section. And if you think about a caesarean section, you can do quite a lot of caesarean sections can be performed in one morning if they're planned in advance. You've got this growth of birth taking place in these ways at the same time as there's a lot of pressure to keep the costs spent on the labour power of birth workers to a minimum. So it often feels to me now like you've got a conveyor belt system of birth. But in this era of neoliberal capitalism, whatever we want to call the era that we're currently in, the conveyor belt in this, it's not even staffed properly. So in this era of cuts in health expenditure, austerity measures, we've got a conveyor belt system that doesn't even have sufficient staff to staff it. So yes, the labour process, work process, if you like, of many midwives has changed hugely over the years. And as a result, so is the use of unnecessary and unwanted interventions in childbirth, each of which, it must be remembered, can have side effects which can be quite serious of their own.